All right, back for another deep dive. And today we're taking on cybersecurity, but more specifically, two concepts that often get confused, even though they're super important for staying safe online. We're talking about authentication and authorization.
Absolutely. Those are critical concepts to grasp.
Yeah, and to help us really get into it, you've sent over an article from Delinea and, wow, a whole stack of YouTube videos from cybersecurity guru Bert Blevins. So are we ready to get well-informed, as Bert likes to say?
I think so, yeah. And I'm glad we're tackling these together because even though the terms sound so similar, they really play different roles in how we secure systems and data.
Okay, so let's start with the first one, authentication. Is it really just about proving you are who you say you are, like showing your ID?
Yeah, it's pretty much a digital handshake. It's all about verifying identity.
Right.
Think about like those old spy movies where they have to go through voice recognition or retinal scans to get access.
Yeah.
Authentication is kind of like that, but in the digital world. Passwords is the classic example, but we're seeing more and more biometrics like fingerprint scanning or facial recognition coming into play.
Right, and then there's that extra layer of security, multi-factor authentication, or MFA, where you need something you know, like a password, and something you have, like a code from your phone. Didn't Bert Blevins have a video on that?
Oh, he definitely did.
Yeah.
In OTP MFA Explained, he walks you through how to actually set it up using those, popular authenticator apps.
Yeah.
And it's a good one to watch because while MFA can seem kind of a pain, it's really not that hard to do.
You know what? I'll take a little extra hassle for some peace of mind, so it sounds worth it. Okay, so we've proven who we are, but then how do we control what we can do once we're in? That's where authorization comes in, right?
Exactly. Authorization kicks in after you've been authenticated. It determines what you're allowed to access or what actions you can take within a system. Think of it like having different levels of security clearance.
Got it. Okay, so more levels. I'm seeing a pattern here. So it's not just a simple yes or no once you're in. There are nuances to it.
Yeah, definitely. There are a few key ways authorization is managed. A popular one is role-based access control, or RBAC. That one focuses on assigning permissions based on roles instead of individual users.
So instead of saying Bob from accounting can access this, it's more like anyone with the accountant role has these permissions.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. It really helps keep things organized, especially in larger companies. You can imagine how complicated it would get if you had to manage access for each individual person.
Right, that's a good point. RBAC actually sounds like it could be a time saver in a way. But what about when you need even more control, like super specific control over who sees what?
Well, then you might turn to access control lists, or ACLs.
Yeah.
Those are much more granular, like a very specific guest list for each file or resource. It spells out exactly who can access it and what they can do with it. Like, can they read it, edit it, or even delete it?
So it's like setting very specific permissions for each document.
Interesting. So what happens when it's not just about someone's role? What if you need to take more things into account?
That's where policy-based access control, or PBAC, shines. It uses policies to determine access, but it considers a bunch of different factors, not just a person's role. So things like their location, the time of day, even the device they're using and its security level all play a role.
Wait, hold on. So even the device I'm using could affect what I can access?
Exactly. Flexibility and context are key with PBAC. For example, let's say you're trying to access sensitive financial data, but you're using your phone on public Wi-Fi. PBAC might flag that as a high risk and deny you access. But if you try from your work computer on a secure network, it would likely be fine.
Wow, okay. It's kind of like having a security system that adapts to the situation. I'm starting to see how all these different authorization methods work together.
Yeah, they do. And choosing which one to use really depends on what the organization needs and what kind of resources they're trying to protect. Now, it's super clear why we need both authentication and authorization. You can't have one without the other, or you're just asking for trouble, right?
You're exactly right. Imagine a company with amazing authentication. They've got MFA, biometrics, the whole 9 yards, but their authorization is a mess.
So you're saying the right people are getting in, but once they're inside, it's a free-for-all. They can access anything they want.
Exactly. Or on the flip side, imagine this super secure fortress, incredible security measures inside, but the front gate is wide open.
Oh no, anyone could just stroll in.
That's exactly what could happen if authentication is weak.
Okay, now I'm getting a little nervous just thinking about it. This isn't just theoretical stuff. We're talking about protecting our own data here, right? Our bank accounts, emails, social media.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about protecting your personal information. You hit the nail on the head. Security is everyone's responsibility, and understanding these concepts is the first step.
All right, so we've got the basics down. But Bert Blevins, in those materials you sent, he goes beyond the basics, right? He dives into some pretty advanced stuff, like what are just-in-time permissions?
He does. JIT is a really interesting approach to authorization. The idea is to minimize risk by only granting access when it's absolutely needed and only for a limited time.
Ah, okay. So it's like getting a temporary key card that only works for a specific room and only for a set amount of time. Is that what he's getting at in his just-in-time permissions explained video?
Yeah. He gives some great real-world examples in that one. It really shows you how much safer those tight controls can make things, especially for sensitive systems.
So it's not just who has access, but when and for how long.
Got it. Now, what about unlimited admin mode? That one sounds a little, well, risky.
Oh, I know, right? It sounds a bit counterintuitive. But Delinea, they're a big name in cybersecurity. They've developed this solution that gives admins the flexibility they need, but without compromising on security.
Okay, how does that even work? Does Bert cover that in his Exploring Unlimited Admin Mode video? Oh, he does. And he actually brings up some of the same concerns you just did.
Yeah.
He really digs into how they manage the risks, by putting in place strong monitoring, auditing, and really tight control mechanisms.
Interesting. I'm adding that one to my watch list. And then there's password rotation, specifically in Red Hat Linux. That sounds like a real pain to manage.
It can be if you're doing it manually, yeah. But in his video, Rotating Passwords in Red Hat Linux, Bert shows you how you can actually automate the whole process.
Automation, a lifesaver. But why even go through all that password rotation? I mean, what's the point?
Well, it's all about limiting the damage if a password does get compromised. It's like changing the locks on your house after you lose a key. By rotating passwords regularly, you're shrinking the window of opportunity for attackers to exploit them.
That's a good way to think about it. So it's not enough to have strong passwords, we also need to change them up often.
Exactly. And like I said, with automation, it doesn't have to be a major headache.
Well, these examples really share how authentication and authorization play out in the real world, and it's a constantly evolving field.
It absolutely is. Security is a journey, not a destination.
And speaking of journeys, this deep dive has me thinking. As technology changes, so do the ways we authenticate and authorize, right? What does that future even look like? What new challenges will we face?
Those are great questions, and they're exactly what we'll be tackling in our next segment.
Stay tuned, everyone. And we're back for more of the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about authentication and authorization, how those are really the cornerstones of cybersecurity. But this isn't a static field, right? It seems like every day there's some new threat popping up or some new technology changing how we have to think about it.
You're not wrong. It really is constantly evolving, and I think one of the biggest things shaking things up is the cloud. I mean, so many companies are moving their data, their applications, everything to the cloud, and that just opens up a whole new set of challenges.
That's a good point. We've been talking about securing systems in a more general sense, but the cloud adds this whole other layer, right? So what kind of specific threats are we talking about here?
Well, one thing that Bert Blevins really hit on in his video, Cloud Security Threats You Never Knew Existed, is the idea of cloud identity discovery. Basically, these attackers are getting smarter. Once they get into a system, they can start mapping out the whole cloud environment.
So they're making like a blueprint of the company's cloud infrastructure. That's kind of terrifying. What can they even do with that information?
It's like giving them a roadmap to everything, all the potential targets and vulnerabilities. They can see what cloud services a company's using, Azure AD, Office 365, all that. And then they can start figuring out how to exploit them.
Okay, so we need to be just as careful about securing our cloud environments as we are about securing our physical systems. But how do we even start? The cloud feels so vast and kind of intangible.
I get it. It can feel that way. But a lot of the same principles we've already talked about still apply. Strong authentication, strong authorization. Those are key. Make sure your cloud accounts are locked down with MFA, and that access is really tightly controlled.
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm guessing the things we talked about before, like JIT permissions and unlimited admin mode, those become even more important in the cloud.
Absolutely, especially JIT permissions. In the cloud, it's so important to make sure that any temporary access is granted only when it's absolutely necessary and then revoked as soon as it's not needed anymore.
Okay, starting to see how all these pieces fit together, like we're building a security system with layers, right? But even with all that, even with everything in place, can't human error still mess things up?
Unfortunately, yeah, there's always that risk. That's why it's so important to educate users. You can have the most sophisticated security in the world, But if employees aren't aware of the risks and don't know how to protect themselves, well, it can all be undermined.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about the people too, right? We need a culture of security within an organization.
Exactly. People need to understand why strong passwords are so important, how to spot phishing emails, why keeping their software up to date matters. All those things might seem small, but they can make a huge difference.
You know, it's funny you mentioned passwords. We talked about them earlier, but it seems like passwords have been around forever, and yet they're still one of the biggest weaknesses, aren't they?
It's true. Passwords, they're convenient, but they're so easily compromised. And when you have to remember so many, it's easy to fall into bad habits, like reusing them or making them too simple, too easy to guess.
And that's a recipe for disaster. It feels like we're overdue for something better, something to replace passwords altogether. Is there anything on the horizon that could do that?
There are some really interesting things being developed. Biometrics, like we talked about, that's becoming more common. But imagine a world where you could authenticate just with a brainwave scan or by analyzing your heartbeat.
Okay, now that sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But who knows, maybe it's not that far off.
It might be closer than we think. Technology is always advancing. The bigger question is, how do we balance that convenience with security? Because as these methods become more advanced, aren't they also potentially more intrusive?
That's a really good point. It's a tough balance. We want strong security, but we don't want it to be so difficult that it gets in the way of actually using technology.
Right, exactly. Nobody wants to have to jump through a million hoops just to check their email or visit a website. So it's a challenge for these cybersecurity folks. They have to figure out how to develop solutions that are both secure and easy to use.
So finding that sweet spot where security and usability meet, that's the goal. Speaking of security, I was really interested in what Bert Blevins said about secrets in his video on building resilient secrets for disaster recovery. It's not something we tend to think about too much, but what happens to all that sensitive stuff like passwords and encryption keys if there's some kind of disaster?
That's such an important point, and it often gets overlooked. Disaster recovery, it's not just about backups, it's about security too. We need a plan for how to recover from a cyber attack or any kind of disaster, and that includes making sure our secrets are protected.
So it's not just about making sure we can get our data back, but that those critical pieces of information, the passwords and encryption keys, those are secure and can be restored too.
Exactly. If those are compromised or lost, recovery becomes so much harder. Blevins recommends techniques like secret splitting, where you actually take a secret, divide it into multiple parts, and store each part in different locations.
Oh, so that way, even if one part gets compromised, the whole secret isn't lost. That's smart. Like having multiple backup keys for your safe hidden in different places.
Perfect analogy. It's all about layers of resilience, layers of protection, and that's what disaster recovery is all about. Planning for the worst, but hoping for the best.
Well said. It's like having a fire drill for your data. You might never need it, but if you do, you'll be glad you practiced.
That's right. And with that, I think we've covered a lot in this segment. From cloud security to disaster recovery, it's clear that security is a really complex challenge.
But it's not just about reacting to threats. It's about trying to anticipate what's coming next. So in our final segment, we're going to look at some emerging trends, really try to get a glimpse of what the future of cybersecurity might hold.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've gone from the basics of authentication and authorization all the way to the cloud and even disaster recovery. But now I'm really curious, what's NXT for cybersecurity? It feels like things are changing so fast, like we're on the edge of something big.
You're right. It's a really exciting time. The future of cybersecurity is full of possibilities. But, and this is a big but, it's not all, sunshine and roses. As technology keeps advancing, so do the threats. Right? It's like this constant arms race. We got to be ready for whatever's coming next.
Makes sense. We've already talked about the cloud and how that's kind of a game changer, but what other big trends are you seeing out there?
Well, one that's impossible to ignore is artificial intelligence, AI. I mean, it's already being used in cybersecurity, but its impact is just going to get bigger and bigger in the coming years. We're talking about systems that can look at huge amounts of data, find those patterns, and spot things that would totally slip past a human.
It's like having a super-powered security guard that never sleeps. But AI isn't just on our side, right? I've heard that attackers are using it too to come up with even more sophisticated attacks.
That's the thing, it's a double-edged sword. AI-powered attacks, they can be really targeted and a lot harder to detect. It's not the most comforting thought, but it's the reality. We need to be sure our defenses are evolving as fast as the threats are.
So an AI arms race, exciting and a little bit scary all at the same time. But even with all this AI, it seems like we'll always need that human element in cybersecurity, won't we?
Absolutely. AI is an amazing tool, but it's not going to solve everything. We still need people, experts, who can understand the tech and make sure it's being used correctly, ethically.
Right. It's not about blindly trusting machines to do all the work for us. So besides AI, what else is coming down the pipeline? Anything else you're keeping your eye on that could really shake things up?
One area that's ripe for some big changes is authentication. We talked earlier about how passwords are becoming less and less reliable. They're just too easy to steal, too much of a hassle to manage. Biometrics is one direction, but I think we'll see even more innovative solutions pop up.
What, are we all going to have microchips implanted in our brains? Okay, maybe that's a bit extreme, but seriously, what could possibly replace passwords?
Well, one interesting possibility is behavioral biometrics. It analyzes how you interact with your devices, things like your typing style, how you move your mouse, even the way you walk, to verify your identity.
So it's like creating a digital fingerprint, but it's based on your behavior? That's wild.
Yeah, it is. And it's way harder to fake than a traditional password. Another thing to watch for is continuous authentication. So instead of just logging in once and being good to go, it continuously checks your identity in the background, looking at your behavior, the context, everything.
It's like having an invisible security guard always making sure it's really you.
Pretty much. It's always on, always verifying, always working to protect you.
But wouldn't that feel super intrusive? I like the idea of being protected, but I don't want to feel like someone's watching my every move.
I hear you. That's a valid concern. Privacy is huge here. Continuous authentication has to be done in a way that respects user privacy and data security.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance, which isn't always easy.
Right, security and privacy have to go hand in hand, not be fighting each other. Okay, now let's switch gears to authorization. We covered RBAC, ACLs, PBAC, but where do you see authorization heading in the future?
Well, one approach that's gaining traction is attribute-based access control, or ABA. It's like PBAC, but even more powerful, even more fine-grained control. It uses all sorts of attributes to make decisions about access. It's not just your role or your department anymore, but also things like your location, the time of day, the device you're using, even your current risk profile.
So the security system is adapting in real time based on all that information. That's incredible.
That's the idea. It just makes so much more sense, especially as cloud computing and the Internet of Things become more and more common.
Definitely in those environments where things are always changing, you need that kind of flexibility. Anything else in authorization we should be watching out for?
Other cool area is risk-based authentication and authorization. So instead of just looking at who you are, it also considers how risky a particular user or action might be.
So like if I'm trying to get into a sensitive system, but I'm using my phone on public Wi-Fi in a different country, red flags are going to go off.
Exactly. The system might ask for more proof that it's really you or even block you completely. It's about being smarter, being more context aware.
It sounds like the future of cybersecurity is all about adaptation, evolution, staying ahead of the curve.
That's it. It's a challenge, but it's also really exciting. There's always something new to learn, new tech to explore, new ways to make the online world safer.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into authentication and authorization. We've covered a lot today, but really, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
We've given you the tools, we've given you the knowledge. Now it's up to you to keep thinking critically, keep exploring.
Exactly. Stay curious, keep learning, and remember, in the digital world, we're all responsible for keeping things secure.
Stay safe online.
And that's your deep dive for this week. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring.